After all that theory, it's time to do something and have some fun in Unity. As you can see, I'm going to have a quick look at the terrain. So I'll go to Unity. We'll create a new scene. Before we start working on the terrain, let's get some assets that we can use with our terrain. So let's go over to the Asset Store. And when that's loaded, of course, log into your account. We're just going to use the search here. I'm looking for terrain assets. Here we have Unity's terrain assets. So again, we can look at the description. We can read some comments. And we can look at the contents of this package, all the assets in the package. Okay, so we have a lot of different objects here, some bushes. We have some grass for our terrain. Then we come to some textures. We can paint our terrain. And we have some trees. Okay, so if you haven't grabbed this already, you click the download button. When it's finished downloading the package, click the import. Well, you'll come to the import screen, and here it is. And just a quick reminder, when you're importing assets, just check all these news. Make sure you're not importing anything that already exists in your project, because it will be overwritten when you import this. So I'm going to import everything. This does take a minute to load, so I'm going to pause here, come back when they're all imported. Now that the assets in the package have been imported, we have some things we can start working with our terrain. Okay, so let's create a terrain. Click on Terrain, Create Terrain. Here is our terrain without any definition at the moment. It's new. Now first off, if you want to resize your terrain, come to Terrain, Set Resolution. And here, in the width and the length, is where you change your resolution. At the moment that's set to 2,000 units, or roughly 2 kilometers. I set it to 500 units. Let's have a look at that. So you can see the terrain has now resized. So terrain, set resolution. Of course you have the height here, but you won't see this in effect until we start raising and lowering our terrain. So we have our terrain. Let's go over to the Unity documentation. We can look at the user manual and see if they have any information on terrain. Here we are, Terrain Engine Guide. On that, we have the Unity user manual for using terrains, modifying terrains. You can click on each one of these titles and go into further detail and explanation. Okay, so all the information on terrains is here already. There's another site. The Unify community, or the Unity Wiki. We have tutorials over here. Amongst all these things. Here we have the terrain tutorial. So as well as the user manual, we have the Unity Wiki manual, which goes into a lot of detail. Okay, so there's just a couple of sources to learn about manipulating and editing terrains. And finally, there's one I always refer people to, back to the Unity cookie. Okay, what we're looking for here is Introduction to Character Controls. As you see, there's a lot of Unity tutorials here too. And here's the tutorial I was looking for. So you have the URL there. I'm showing you how to find it for yourselves. This will show you two aspects of Unity. The terrain, as we're covering now, and also a bit of an introduction to character controllers. Okay, so there's that resource there. So we imagine that we've had a look at a few of them, so we want to modify our terrain. First we'll look at a height. So I'm just going to set a height. What we do is we select a brush, and then if you hover over the terrain, you can see as you set the size, it changes the size of the brush. So we can work in a small area, we can try and affect a large area. And the opacity is how strong that brush affects the area. I think it's best demonstrated. So we start with a very solid brush. We'll start with the opacity very high. See immediately, as soon as I move the mouse, we have a very strong effect with our brush on the terrain. So that's very strong. Now, if I bring the opacity down, work in the same kind of area, see, it's having a much less impact on that terrain there. We'll bring it up to halfway so you can even see a little difference. There you go, just in a few strokes, that seems to be working much stronger on the terrain than when it's low. There you go. So that's modifying the height, and that's just with a blocky brush. And then you try out all the other brushes. So we have fuzzy brush. Imagine this will give us some small, smoother hills and areas. So terrain is meant to be worked on. It's a close thing. It's an artistic thing. So you've got to work on detail. Okay. Pick your area, pick the size of your brush, start painting the terrain. So now we have another height. But here we have an extra parameter where we can set the height that we want to cap the terrain out to. So for example, see how I've set a height here. We paint the terrain. You see we're getting a very flattened area here. It's because the terrain will not be painted above that height. Let's check that by bringing that up. And we have it again. We come to a much larger height. Modify the height again. Now we can see Now we can set the height of our brush too. Of course, we've only played with a couple of brushes. Try all the different brushes out. Okay, the opacity is on that very strong. So I'll bring the opacity right down. As I said, you want to work in small areas. And slowly modify your terrain. You start to get the kind of feel that you want. Just before I go on, the height tool can be handy in other ways. Or if you wanted to make a canyon, bring the brush size up too, and the strength. So I'll start off by bringing the height up in this area here. I'm starting to cap out. Okay. I started by bringing the height of our terrain up. I can bring the height down, select a different brush, and start to carve into the terrain. See, that looks a bit deceiving from this angle. If I zoom in, change the angle, see we are indeed now carving into our terrain. That's how you can sculpt inwards rather than downwards rather than upwards. There we go, and we've also capped out at the bottom there. Down a bit more. Very bottom. Okay, so you can raise the height and dig in, or you can just raise the height as you like. So what do we have here? So we've looked at the height, we've grabbed a few different brushes, we've done some modifications to our terrain. Let's add some fine tuning. Okay, so we have a smoothing tool here, pretty much the same kind of settings. We'll select the size of our brush, we check the strength, how much is the smoothing going to affect our terrain, and start painting an area. You see that smoothing out, all those peaks are starting to become rounded. There we go. Okay. Just give it a bit more of a natural look there. Take out some of those jaggies. Okay, so again, when you're working in a small area, you're concentrating on the definition of things, you can really start to get subtle effects and more controlled effects for how you want your terrain to look. Okay, same thing here, we'll probably blur different areas. Zoom in there. So you've still got the jaggies in between. Great. So that's looking at 3 of the tools here. Now we've got a bit of a plain looking terrain at the moment, so let's add some texture to it. We'll come to the paintbrush here. Currently there's no textures to be applied to our terrain, so we have to add some textures. So we have the selectable window here. You can navigate here and select your texture. Or you can go to your projects folder, find your textures, and just drag a texture in. Add. Now that we have a texture, that has been applied to the whole terrain, as you can see. Just bring these down so they don't affect the terrain while I'm moving around. Okay, so that's not the end of the story. We can add more textures. Grass. Okay, so we can add in a few more textures. And as you see, there was something I was going to demonstrate before, but I've just demonstrated it now. I had a texture selected. I chose Edit Texture. So the texture that was already there, I changed. So you can also change your textures even after you've painted them. Just say you want some grass with more dirt in it rather than just plain grass in an area, but you've already painted it. Just swap your textures out. Okay, so we're back to cliff there. Now let's add a third texture. Let's add another texture. Okay. Okay, secondly, you may be seeing tiling over this area, but don't forget that is a 2-kilometer area. You've got to imagine what the player can see. So you have to come down to the player's perspective here. Okay. Sometimes you need to drop in an object for reference, or simply run the project and walk around and see what you think doesn't feel right. So just say I thought the tiling of that texture was too small. So we'll click on the texture, we'll click Edit Texture, and here is where you set the tiling for your terrain textures. So let's just double that. You can see that having an immediate effect. Okay, so just by doubling the size of our texture, increase the scale. When you come up close, it looks far more natural. Okay, so now we have some textures. Let's start painting them onto our terrain. Of course, this is pretty much the same method. Choose your brush, set your size, set the strength, the opacity, how much the brush affects over time, and target strength we'll have to have a bit of a play with. Painting here. Let's bring the target strength down and see what happens now. Okay, so that's pretty much working parallel to opacity. You see the amount of strength. Bring the opacity right down. Okay, so target strength is really how much paint you are applying. If I bring that up, pretty much immediately dark. Bring that down. It's more of a blend, isn't it? It's how much the texture will blend to the next texture. It's the strength. Okay? So again, just like I am right now, experiment with these different parameters and see what kind of effects you can come out of them. So we'll make the strength quite strong for this whole ground area. All that in. There we go. Again, you shouldn't be painting such large areas like this. Terrain is kind of a fine tune. Okay, so we can start bringing in some grass, change our brushes, change our strengths. Again, as you're starting to see, I'm very much a coder more than a programmer. So doing artistic things doesn't come as naturally. Something went wrong there. Let's try and see if we can blend that back. Okay, so again, as you're painting and doing your things, try and bring yourself back and look at everything from the perspective of the player. Let's bring the brush size down so you can see. So if I was the player, that grass does look tiled to me, whereas the grass on the hill is looking much better. If I was coming here, I was walking along, see that grass looks alright. But this floor here is not so great. So let's edit that. Bring up the tiling. You can see it modifying there. Okay, that looks a bit more natural. Coming from a dirt kind of area. Let's focus on there. Okay, so we're walking along, starting to look much more natural. Okay. The hill to where I painted some more. There we go, we're starting to get some grass and dirt. So you can see, from a distance, it might not look fantastic, but you've got to imagine from the perspective of the player, and you can see where the magic is actually starting to happen. Alright? That dark area. Scroll away from. What's a dark area? Okay? So it's painting textures on terrains. Now, if you saw in my last video, assets, I actually imported terrain as well. Now that is a terrain I created, so I'm going to rename it Terrain 1. the first. Okay, so we can have different terrains. We have to name these and keep these separate, because if we modify this, this will be modified in all scenes. This is not like a prefab. Well, it is more like a prefab. If you modify the terrain anywhere, you are modifying the main terrain. Anyway, so as I said, if you're starting to have your terrains look a bit like mine there, and you really wish to have something that looks a little bit better, then grab the height field pack I demonstrated in the assets. Okay, there's a few terrains here. We'll have a look at them. Again, see, it looks like it's not doing much from that scope. You have to imagine it from the perspective of the player. You know what, let's just make it nicer by giving it a texture too. Okay, so up with moss. Okay, wow. It immediately starts to bring in what I was trying to demonstrate. That terrain does have some good details. If I was a player walking along this terrain right here, then that would look quite nice. Coming up to those hills and walking across those hills. Okay, so there's definitely some assets out there yourself. Now thirdly, you can also create height maps and import height maps for your terrain. Now I really don't know much about height maps because it needs a special raw format, which is a grayscale, special bit buffer size kind of thing. Okay, but while I think of it, there is another resource